even President Trump himself began to acknowledge some sense of reality.
Can afford to go slower and extract more concessions for each step forward that the United States or others seek to pursue with North Korea.
I think is a kind of symbol of some of the challenges that are facing this process.
The ships freely entered South Korean ports more than 20 times ever since.
The maximum pressure has become a lot more difficult as a result of the fact that we're now in this dialogue with North Korea.
And we've already seen China and Russia openly advocating for lifting of sanctions on North Korea at the United Nations.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. President Donald Trump says there is no rush in negotiations with North Korea, that we have no time limit nor speed limit. This is a shift of stance from before the Singapore summit, when he emphasized denuclearizing in a very short period of time and in an all-in-one manner. Today we'll discuss what prompted President Trump's change of heart.
They're going very, very well. We have no rush for speed. We have no time limit. We have no speed limit.
Progress on some issues, there's a lot of work to do. It may take some time to get where we need to go.
My guest today, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder worked as an Asia specialist in many think tanks for more than 20 years. Also joining us today, Mr. Ryan Haas, a fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Haas was the Director for China at the National Security Council from 2013 to 2017 and served as U.S. diplomat for 15 years, mostly in Asia. Let me give you the first question. President Trump indicated that this is going to be a long process. What about North Korea that prompted President Trump to change his approach towards North Korea? If any one of you can start us off.
Well, I just think that this process is maybe a little bit more difficult than people had expected, and it's, I think, a natural result of what happens when aspirations meet reality. We certainly have seen a struggle, I think, in terms of contending definitions of what would constitute success. Even President Trump himself began to acknowledge some sense of reality in referring to the fact that North Korea preferred a phased process versus an all-in-one process even before the Singapore summit. And I think that that has proven to be a critical concern in the follow-on to the summit.
Ryan, do you want to add?
Well, I would just add that I think for President Trump, personal relationships matter a lot. And after Singapore, President Trump believes that he's established a rapport with Kim Jong-un and that through that relationship, the threat from North Korea to the United States has been diminished. And as the threat is diminished, the sense of urgency also is diminished. And it's reflected in some of the things that President Trump has said about the problem being solved and the issue being taken care of. It's this sense that as the relationship improves, the threat diminishes, and therefore there isn't the same sense of urgency that there may have been in the past.
Secretary Pompeo initially said that follow-on discussions will follow 1 week after the Singapore summit, but he actually went to Pyongyang 3 weeks after, and there's no progress on denuclearization. Why do you think there's slow progress?
Well, in the last several months, I think that the leverage that the international community has had with North Korea has gone down, and North Korea has felt less pressure and therefore has felt that it has more time on its side and can afford to go slower and extract more concessions for each step forward that the United States or others seek to pursue with North Korea.
How much of this is driven by the two leaders, and how important is the personal rapport between President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un?
Well, from my perspective, I have no reason to doubt that President Trump and Chairman Kim have a decent relationship, that they got along fine in Singapore. But I don't necessarily subscribe to the belief that personal chemistry alone will solve this problem. I think at the end of the day, national interests are going to be what drives decisions. And 3 generations of the Kim family have been pursuing the treasured sword of North Korea's nuclear program. And I don't think that personal chemistry or persuasion is going to be the decisive factor in how this moves forward.
Mm-hmm.
Another way of saying the same thing is really that both sides have a certain type of vertical integration problem that occurs in the gap between the personal relationship and the relationship between institutions. And the institutions within the DPRK government and the US government have been at odds with each other for such a long time. And yet those institutions also have to find an area of common effort where they can work on in order to overcome distrust. Mm-hmm. And that process is going to be much more difficult than just having a handshake between leaders.
Mm-hmm. President Trump said the process is moving along, and the spokesperson for the State Department says that she's not going to read out every single conversation with North Korea. So can we believe that there is a closed-door consultations, that there are confidence-building works underway?
We can believe that that is the case, but the real issue here is that in order for this process to be credible, it needs to contain verification, and there also needs to be an element of transparency. And I think that what we see is growing frustration, frankly, on Capitol Hill with the level of transparency that characterizes the interaction between the U.S. and North Korea. Legislators want to know what is happening. The U.S. public also is entitled to know what is happening with this process. And if we are unsure about where things stand, it makes it much harder to be able to make a cogent evaluation of whether or not we have a timeline, what is the schedule that we're looking at, what are the benchmarks in order to really determine whether or not denuclearization and reconciliation are actually occurring.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, President Trump approaches North Korean issues in a very unorthodox way, and from considering a preventive attack against North Korea to having the first ever summit with the North Korean leader, what drives President Trump in formulating North Korea policies?
Well, my perspective is that there are three big drivers for President Trump. One is that all the efforts of his predecessors have failed, and so should not be repeated. Another is that unpredictability is an asset, that he wants to keep people off balance and guessing as to what he wants to do. And then the third is, I think he has a strong belief in the power of his own personality and of his ability to get in a room with someone and persuade them of the course that they should take. And those three factors combined sort of explain the shifts that we've seen from threatening war at one point to engaging at a leader level in the next. They're both unconventional. They both are unpredictable, and they both are different than what President Trump's predecessors have pursued. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know, I think the verdict is still out on whether or not that will be the basis of sound strategy. I have my doubts, but I think that this process should be given an opportunity to see what it can produce.
Mm-hmm. Scott?
So there's an interesting argument that uncertainty maximization may have been critical in helping to bring North Korea to the table. Mm-hmm. But then you also need command of a level of detail necessary in order to drive home the agreement. And in many respects, I think that the most frustrating aspect of what we saw in Singapore and the aftermath is that we finally met the decision maker, but it's not clear that we got the decision. And I think that until we know that we have the decision and we see evidence that the decision has occurred and we see benefits flowing from it, mm-hmm. There's always going to be a feeling of that we haven't really closed the deal yet.
Mm-hmm. So we've seen the shift of stance of President Trump so far. Even though President Trump said there's no rush, but if there's no progress for a long time, do you think President Trump will still continue on this stance?
My sense is that President Trump will likely continue on this path for a couple of reasons. The first is that in the absence of a provocation or some embarrassing revelation that brings to light the fact that Kim Jong-un is not sincere in what he has discussed with President Trump, President Trump wants to show that his efforts are successful. He's already declared that the problem's been solved, and he doesn't want to go back on that. I think another factor is that there aren't many other great options available. And so that will keep him on the present course as long as it remains sustainable. And then the third is that President Trump wants to be seen as a peacemaker. And as long as this process is ongoing, he is positioning himself as an agent pursuing peace, which is an attribute that he wants to be able to show both to the American public but also to the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I would argue that there are three things that we've accomplished by entering into the process. One is that the Trump administration was able to buy time as opposed to feeling like it had run out of time. Secondly, the prospect of immediate confrontation, which is the trajectory on which we are headed, has been alleviated. And then third, interestingly enough, I think that President Trump, a lot of times if you have an intractable problem, one aphorism is that the way to address that problem is to enlarge it. And I think that he has done that by connecting the nuclear issue with the broader issues of peace. Mm-hmm. But then, how do we move forward with that? That's the dilemma, and I think that in that respect, the challenge that we have is our traditional conception of a negotiation process is one that involves reciprocity. But the record doesn't show that the North Koreans really believe in reciprocity. And then on the North Korean side, the challenge is that they want a consistent partner. And the U.S. government, especially led by a president that likes to trade in uncertainty maximization, is not going to be able to provide the level of consistency that is going to be necessary to support the process.
My last question before we go, so North Korea may want to stall the process and just keep talking and not provoke United States directly, but at the same time try to keep its weapons and become like Pakistan. So how can we stop this from happening?
Well, I think that Vice Minister Kim Kye-gwan essentially stated that was North Korea's objective, to be like Pakistan to Chris Hill back in the mid-2000s. And so that is precisely the challenge. How can we do it? I think that the only way to do it is through the consistent application and continuous application of coercive diplomacy, which is basically continuing pressure, but also trying to pull North Korea forward towards a negotiated settlement. Mm-hmm.
My Brookings colleague Jeff Bader and I wrote about this very issue earlier this week on the Brookings website, and there is a concern that the United States will, in effect, recognize nuclear North Korea, much as we did with Pakistan, on the basis that North Korea is no longer hostile to the United States, so therefore we can afford to allow it to possess nuclear weapons. And our concern is that if President Trump were to meet with Kim Jong-un a second time, without achieving tangible progress on denuclearization. And at the same time, if the alliance between the United States and South Korea were to begin to unravel a bit, that could strike a mortal blow to American credibility, not just in Asia, but in the rest of the world. So I think that you've put your finger on a very important issue that merits further attention, focus, and discussion.
Well, we'll end this conversation here and watch video for our next discussion. South Korea acknowledged 9,000 tons of North Korean coal entered its soil last October. Seoul didn't seize the ships at the time and do not know the whereabouts of the unloaded coal. The ships freely entered South Korean ports more than 20 times ever since. Now, the United States and Pyongyang are engaged in discussions right now, so this thawing of relations, how is this affecting sanctions implementations by third countries?
Well, I think that the maximum pressure strategy began to lose air on March 8th when President Trump announced that he was going to meet with Kim Jong-un. It's just incredibly difficult to put a diplomatic process on track and continue to apply pressure, and especially to signal to partners that they need to continue to apply pressure. And so I think that that's the dilemma that we're definitely facing now. President Trump has said the problem is solved, and yet Secretary of State Pompeo has said that we have to continue to apply sanctions until North Korea denuclearizes, but it's not clear that we can pursue those two strands of thought simultaneously and achieve the desired result.
And just to put another spin on this, what Scott is saying isn't just something that experts have made up, it's something that President Trump himself has described. He has said that he no longer wants to use the phrase maximum pressure to talk about the United States' approach to North Korea. And so this has created a permissive environment for other countries to punch holes in the sanctions regime. And we've already seen China and Russia openly advocating for lifting of sanctions on North Korea at the United Nations.
Can we think that South Korean government was turning its blind eye when we look at this case?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily want to rush to judgment on that. I think that South Korea demonstrated good adherence in action to efforts to interdict North Korean ships at an earlier stage. We don't know the circumstances around these coal shipments that might have led to the entry of the coal into South Korea. Certainly the South Korean government will continue to investigate it, and I think that the South Korean government, at least President Moon, rhetorically seems to be still committed to sanctions despite challenges internally in mood in South Korea to the idea of doing more economically with North Korea.
Now, Ryan, the two ships entered through the Russian port of Omsk. So what does this say about the Russian implementation?
Well, the Russians throughout this entire process, including at the apex of the maximum pressure campaign, have been committed stubbornly to preserving certain links between North Korea and Russia. And that has continued up to this day. I think it suggests that Russia is very focused on maintaining its leverage with North Korea, and that it will continue to privilege its own economic interests first, even as it seeks to limit the exposure of its sanctions busting second.
Now, Secretary Pompeo visits the United Nations, and now that the talks have not making any progress so far, how important is sanctions implementations for the U.S. side?
Well, the implementation is going to continue to be important, but the U.S. has suffered a setback, I think, at the UN because the U.S. had tried to raise the issue of violations of the sanctions regime regarding oil products, ship-to-ship transfers to North Korea. And it looks like the Russians and the Chinese have shot down that proposal to try to strengthen the cap on those transfers. And so now I think it's just a good demonstration of the fact that trying to push forward on maximum pressure has become a lot more difficult as a result of the fact that we're now in this dialogue with North Korea.
And I would add one other dimension as well, which is that the United States and China presently are facing intense trade frictions, which is complicating the backdrop or the overall environment for U.S.-China cooperation on North Korea. So not only is the diplomatic track proceeding, but tit-for-tat tariffs are proceeding alongside it, and it's creating a less permissive environment for cooperation between the United States and China and North Korea.
Well, we'll end it here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. The photo today shows North Korean leader Kim Jong-un visiting the Orangcheon power station construction site. During the visit, Chairman Kim was extremely furious, asking why the power station was only 70% finished 17 years after breaking ground. He recently visited 8 economic sites in North Hamgyong province bordering China and sharply criticized their poor management. Now, Scott, what's your reaction?
It's a mixed reaction. On the one hand, it's good that Kim Jong-un is upset about problems in terms of economic performance in North Korea. And so I'm glad that he cares about the economy. But at the same time, I'm having a little bit of a problem because North Korea is supposed to be moving away from central planning guidance, and here the leader is giving central planning guidance on the economy.
Ryan?
I would just add that I'd much rather Kim Jong-un travel to this site than missile sites or nuclear sites, and I welcome his focus on economic issues going forward.
I welcome that too. On that note, we'll end it here. Ryan, Scott, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Thank you for watching.